religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
10 racconti di solidarietà e aiuto concreto. Storie ricche d'amore, riscatto, coraggio e cura. Storie di persone che donano e che ispirano a costruire una società inclusiva. Una mano a chi sostiene. Storie.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
Dieci racconti di solidarietà e aiuto concreto. Storie ricche d'amore, riscatto, coraggio e cura. Storie di persone che donano e che ispirano a costruire una società inclusiva. Una mano a chi sostiene. Storie.
Che arrivo a salutarti.
Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Facciamo così. Ecco, mettiti lì. Ecco qua. Cominciare. Bene.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is probably one of the last encounters for today, and this session is entitled Demography and Birth Rate. This topic is very topical. The Rimini meeting has often addressed this topic, and it is also there was also an encounter with Deputy Secretary Alfredo Mantovano, who concluded his remarks by saying that actually this was going to be the topic addressed precisely in this session. We are going to address this issue from a number of perspectives. The very important thing to highlight is the fact that we have with us Minister Eugenia Roccella, whom I thank for being here. She is Minister for the Family, Birth Rate and Equal Opportunities. Together with us, we have Professor Giancarlo Blangiardo, former president of Istat, the Italian statistical office. He is a statistician and professor of demography at University of Milano-Bicocca. Then we're going to listen to Matteo Rizzolli, professor of economic policy at LUMSA University. Adriano Bordignon, national president of the Forum of Family Associations. And Giuseppe Zola, the vice president of the Nonni 2.0 Association. The topic is very significant and quite challenging. And therefore, I'd like to leave the floor immediately to Giancarlo Blangiardo. We're going to have a first round of reflections. And together with the other participants in this encounter, I'd like to ask him to kind of give us an overview of the situation. You have the floor, Giancarlo. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I have a piece of paper here with the 10 commandments, actually 10 remarks, which refer to the birth rate. These are basically the things that all of us should know. I'd like to give you some data to try and, in a way, learn a little bit more about the problem and also raise your awareness about this. First point, in the last 9 years, about 1.561 thousand residents got lost in Italy. In other words, the whole of the whole of Milan and Brescia as cities were lost in terms of demography. In other words, we're witnessing a decline in the number of our citizens in our population, which in the history of Italy took place only after the end of the First World War. Starting from 2014. So since 2014, we have gradually lost a number of inhabitants. And this is food for thought, because if we aim to continue being a major country eligible in participating in the G7 or G20 group of nations, we have to have a large population. For example, Luxembourg or the Principality of Monaco aren't among the big countries precisely because of the number of their inhabitants. And we, as a big country, are losing a population. Second point, the major responsibility of this trend derives from the decline in birth rate. 1,035,000 newborns in 1964, and then starting from the mid-70s, we went down to 550,000 in the 1990s. There was a sharp a slight increase at the beginning of the century, and we had in 2008 577,000 newborns. And then since 2008, every year the number of newborns has gone down year after year. Since 2014, just to give you an idea, every year we registered the lowest record in the birth rate in the history of Italy. And every year, we were basically going further down. So at the end of the fair, we can say that in 2022, we had 333,000 newborns. So we went below the threshold of 400,000 newborns. This is the lowest figure ever recorded, and this should also be food for thought, because we have a neighboring country, France, that has a population which is slightly higher than that of Italy, and they registered about 730,000 newborns, and we, conversely, less than 400,000. So this means that there's something that is not going so well. Then I would like to share with you a reflection. This is my third point. Looking at the data, historically, if we look at 1943, in the first quarter of 1943, the war was waging, and probably life was not that easy. In the first quarter of 1943, in the middle of the war, in Italy, 243,191 newborns were registered. In the first quarter of 2023, and with much better living conditions, and of course not in the middle of a war, 91,333 newborns were registered. So 243,000 as against 91,000. Of course, some people might object that those were different conditions and the situation was different. However, what induces me to think is that in a very dramatic situation like that of a war, and in the middle of the war, with soldiers at the front, still there was a sense of future, and that was shown by the birth rate. And that sense of future in our peaceful Italy of the year 2023 is not present. And that, again, is food for thought. Fourth point. So the contribution of immigration to the birth rate in Italy. This is definitely a very important aspect, and that goes without saying, but it is not something that can solve the problem. Newborns in 2012 had gone up to 80,000 newborns of foreign origin. In 2022, the newborns, migrant newborns, went down to 55,000. So in the migrant population in 2004, the migrant population was 23.5 per thousand. So 23.5 per thousand newborns every 1,000 inhabitants. And today we have less than half, 11 per thousand. So this means that the migrant community is still giving a very important contribution. However, for a number of reasons that we all know, still the contribution of the migrant community is kind of getting adapted to this situation that needs to be solved both by the Italians and by the migrant community. So what is the backdrop of all this? According to Istat, the resident population in Italy is expected to go down by 2.9 million residents in the next 20 years, 2.5 million of which should concern the age bracket between 20 to 64. So if one wonders what might happen to our social security resources, we know that the population goes down, and that this affects especially the group of people who are the kind of productive group of people, and that's a fact. We cannot but, in a way, deny this, also in making political decisions, that this is a situation that lies ahead of us. And at the same time, the population aged over 65 in the next 20 years should go up by 4.7 million people. And this figure includes 535,000 people who are going to be older than 90 years of age. This last category of people goes from 842,000 to 1,377,000, and this in 20 years. So the decline in the population in working age is only partly compensated by the contribution given by the migrant community. Today, the group of people aged between 20 to 64 who are migrants make up for 10.6% of the total resident population. If we were to make up for the decline in the working group through migration flows, we would need about 178 net immigrants every year. And this might have, of course, some consequences in terms of integration, because we would have to add about 500,000 people every year, which are expected to be quite difficult to integrate. So to relaunch the birth rate, the creations should be established to, in a way, increase autonomy and the fact that young people leave the house of their parents quite early. Every 100 residents, every 100 residents aged between 30 and 34 who are autonomous from their family, and compared to this figure, there are 444 who live in the family. In 1991, so this data refers to the census of 2021. In 1991, the ratio was 100 to 152. So as you can see, the situation has got worse, and it has got worse to a very significant extent. In other words, we should also act in terms of inducing young people to become parents. Between the people aged between 30 and 34 years of age, out of 100 young people who are already parents, there are 279 young people in the same age bracket who still live in their own family of origin, especially males. The situation over the last few years has got worse, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Up to 2018, the figure was about 150 to 200, especially males. So you already entered the second part of our debate or no? I'm still giving you some data. Okay, this is going to be my last point. We would need a campaign focused on the application of a principle which was adopted in China, which is the single child policy. So later marriages, a longer interval between births, and fewer children. We should do the opposite. So get married earlier, have your children earlier, and have more children if possible. Thank you. So, economic issues. We have given you the general overview. We have Matteo Rizzolli, and we would like to give him the floor. 7 minutes. Probably 4 minutes. So 4 minutes.
Well, first of all, let me start by thanking for this invitation and for being here with the minister and with all the other guests. So the idea now is to tell you very shortly what economists know about the relationship between economy and birth rate. So, first of all, economists started working on this relationship since the very beginning. So Thomas Malthus, putting forward a theory concerning the growth of the population and the features behind this growth. And this was a study that he put forward. And this economist was one of the very first professor of economics at the beginning of the 19th century. And since then, economists have always been focusing and searching on this relationship. And till the very recent years, and I would like to show you the cover of the Economists a few weeks ago. The issue was, the question was, what happens when the population growth? And there are skeptical economists saying that the growth of population is good for the economics, but if it's too fast, it's not that good. So this was the debate which went on over 200 years. And just recently, economists understood that the problem was not the other way around. So it's not concerning when the population growth, what happens then. But there are some further issues to be considered and some new questions to be answered that only now we are starting to explore. And the first thing I'd like to show you is an image. I'd like to share with you this slide. This represents Detroit, an American city. And Detroit is a city that is at the core of the automotive industry, and as long as there was the automotive industry in the US, they had a peak in the 60s and the 70s, and Detroit was one of the first cities in terms of population with 2 million inhabitants. This picture was taken in 2015 when the inhabitants went down to 600,000. So this is just an example of what may happen in an area with a strong loss of population. In this case, the job was missing, and then, of course, workers started going away from the city. Here we are seeing the opposite. We no longer have workers because we have a declining birth rate, and we will see what will happen. So you see here in this image, there are entire districts. You see these squares here that until a few years ago were full of houses, and the people started moving away, and step by step they started leaving entire areas of the cities where just a very few houses are remaining. So apart from issues and challenges linked to crime and criminality, there is also the topic of infrastructures to be considered, because, for example, the municipality of Detroit shall manage infrastructures, means of transport, and so on and so forth, which were designed for millions of inhabitants, while there are actually now just a few hundreds of inhabitants. And Detroit is a very clear example of that, of what's happening. So what was the solution put forward? They started buying the houses of people living more far away. They relocated them closer to the center, and they started destroying the areas of the city which used to be lived, which used to have houses and population in the past. So this is just an example of what happens when there is a decrease in the population of a city. Of course, there are some consequences in terms of public accounts, and Blangiardo already mentioned that yesterday, and the Minister Giuseppe as well mentioned this issue. There is a very important issue in terms of public accounts, because of course if we have less newborn babies, we save money in terms of schools and money allocated to the families, but there is a compensation there in terms of expenditures for older people, which are let's say the most expensive ones in terms of public health and in terms of infrastructures as well. You saw the example in Detroit, the management of infrastructures in a country which has been designed for 60 million people is not the same as managing infrastructures in a country with much lower number of people living there. And there are consequences for the companies as well. We all know that the companies rely on the domestic market for sure. which plays a very important role. And there is, of course, there is also the export. And we know that Italy is quite good in the export, but maybe on the background of this change of the trend in the production specialization, there is also the change in the trend of the birth rate. Our companies are showing and teaching us that there are issues that can be tackled, and one of the topics on which the research is now focusing is the innovation, because a country based on young people has more innovation, while a country with older people and getting older is specialized in sectors which are no longer innovative, and it's will have more troubles to get in and specialize in more innovative sectors. And here again we can think about this fact why Italy is not very well involved in these sectors where there is a very strong innovation, where other countries like the US or China are stronger than us. And the last remark I'd like to share with you concerns families, and also money that families can save. Nowadays, we're saying that we are one of the countries with the highest level of money saved by the families. But we need to know and to consider that according to the Bank of Italy, the 8 times the national GDP is the amount of money of private money saved by families, and 55% of this amount of money is represented by houses and buildings and real estate. So you can imagine what happens to the value of this real estate if these houses are not actually used by people. You can imagine how many villages there are, little villages and cities there are in Italy, where there are houses and buildings sold for just €1, with the only goal of having someone going there and living there. And that's the scenario of what may happen with a declining birth rate. So the value of the real estate will decrease because of this situation. Thank you. I would like now to leave the floor to Adriano Bordignon, National President of the Forum of Family Associations. And let me remind that there is also the Constitution, the Italian Constitution, with some articles which plays a very important role with respect to this topic. Yes, our founding father recognized the central importance and approach of the country for the family, and for sure there was an economic aspect, because it's based on social cohesion and richness, because social cohesion has always been put forward by families, but inclusion as well, because this plays a very important role, and also the participation, so social engagement, political engagement, volunteering as well. These are all things that are taught and learned within the family. But what happened then? Well, Italy, that used to have a family at the core as a pillar for the future of the country, for years has been reducing the investments on the families, and experts are saying that Italy, in its history, never had a long-term project and program investing on the family, and that's what happened, and that's what led us to have to face these challenges now with this background in a world which is more and more complex. And don't forget that the declining birth rate is not just an Italian issue, but this involves all the Western world, involving cultural and personal aspects which are peculiar of the human beings. But in Italy, we have the worst data of all Europe, and that's the situation going ahead for years already. And within the same general and cultural context, we are scoring worse than France, Germany, the Netherlands, that despite being facing challenges nowadays, as we are, they have a welfare scenarios and the context which is better than ours. So what are our experts saying? They're stating that we are living in a context which is compromising the future of our country. So this is not just a background issue of something that we will have to face sooner or later. This is something that we should have faced already in the past, and because after 10 or 12 years since 2008, when we had the last peak at the bottom, we've always been the worst ones in Europe, and we cannot just adapt ourselves to make some minor changes. No, we need to aim at being the best one in Europe at least for 10 years, and that's the challenge. That's the challenge that families are looking for when they call us, they require our help. They say, we are concerned because we would like to have 1 or 2 children. This is our desire, but as a matter of fact, this is not happening because, as Professor Blangiardo said, we are not focusing on hope, on the future, on certainties, because the project, the very important project as the project of having a child, cannot be calculated with an Excel spreadsheet. Of course, for sure, uncertainties, lack of jobs and labor will play a role on the choices of families which are not brave enough to go ahead with these projects. And young people are less and less oriented towards the risks, and they're more and more cautious. And in order to choose and invest in a family, you need to be brave. Pope Francis said it as well. In order to have a family, you need to be brave, but we need to create the conditions for families in order to allow them playing a role in terms of birth rate, in terms of being protagonists in the civil life of our country, and not being just people surrendering in front of the obstacles and finally leaving our country because they can find better conditions in other countries. We need to focus on families that are fighting and they feel as contributing to the well-being of the country with the government, with the state. Today we need an alliance, a structural alliance in order to invest on families. And we are starting from a very challenging point of view, and we keep on going towards the bottom. It's not enough to have little steps forwards, but we need to have big steps forwards. And that's what has been said so far. So one of the most important things concerns women employment, because women employment is definitely lower than the European standards, and there are several reasons behind this situation. And the Minister Roccella for sure is working hard for this topic, because women have play a very important role. They're an heritage for our country, but they need to be in the conditions in order to be allowed to work. And then our young people are leaving their family of origin much later than the other European countries. So they become protagonists of their own life much later than the other European countries. And the third element is the moment in which young people are in the conditions to be able to project and to think about their own family, their own life for the future, and maybe to have a child. And human fertility is not an horizontal line. It's actually decreasing over the time. So these three challenges that we need to face today are for sure very important. We need energy in order to be able to face these challenges, and it's important to know that our government is definitely focused on these aspects. We as a family, we are there, we are working in the best possible way in order to succeed for the future of our country.
Grazie, mi sembra che il quadro sia sufficiente.
Well, I think that what you've all told us is worrying enough to, in a way, move to the second part of a meeting in which we will try and identify some solutions. I'd like to leave the floor to Mr. Zola, who will tell us something on behalf of the grandparents. I'll try and read out because I do not want to miss because actually I would like to be fast, otherwise I'm not going to stick to the time allotted to my speech. I'm going to read to try and tell you what the grandparents have to do with this topic, because normally all of us are older than 65. We have entered the the last stage of our lives. So apparently some people might be tempted to think that the problem does not concern us, but in fact this is not the case, and for two main reasons. There are two main reasons for which grandparents should be involved. So the first topic is an ontological problem, and I'm going to tell you why. I believe that one of the reasons why couples actually have less children today, at least in the Western world, is that we are losing the awareness of being part of a history which binds together different generations. We are losing the awareness and the conscience of this link, as well as the desire to see this story continue, so that the future generations will continue over time, which have always been considered in all religious traditions, the Jewish and the Christian traditions, as a blessing. And also the classical tradition actually saw procreation as an asset. However, as Roccella Scrafia in an article noted, one cannot forget that the current situation was partly determined also by a precise cultural trend, which over the last century basically only focused on the freedom not to have any children or in having just one child. It's very difficult to reverse the demographic trend after the conditions, the biological conditions, and the conditions for the cultural reproduction of our society. And Professor Scrafia in her article states that this very same culture, that it is high time for this culture to kind of apologize for what has been done over the last 100 years, but actually this has never happened so far, and I believe this will never happen. And this, of course, will pose additional problems to our work. When we set up the association Grandparents 2.0, Nonni 2.0, we made reference to our specific role, which is that of serving as guardians, as the guardians of memory, and active witnesses of the virtues and the experiences which have proven to be the right one and the valid ones to face the personal and social challenges of the present times. And these challenges include the fundamental challenge related to giving birth to another human being. Our site includes the text on an important statement between actually the transfer between various generations. Professor Scabini from Cattolica University talked about the generational family chain and states that the generation as the relationship between those who generate, who give birth, and those who are generated is so structured that it is at the very core of our identity. Actually, those who generate have always been generated. Parents are always children, and those who give life to another generation is at the same time the child of the previous generation. And therefore, we have to come to terms with this situation, because it means coming to terms with our own family history and with the symbolic humus that nourished this relationship. So when the vital link between generations gets weaker, also the awareness belonging to a history and a people gets weakened. And this in turn produces the lack of affection of what God, the Lord, has generated in us. That is to say, that of participating in his creative genius. The author also induces us to think that the most important and fundamental task of the adults is to pay attention to these issues. Actually, one needs to basically focus on these aspects. It is difficult to find the charismatic master that sometimes is difficult to find. However, it is important to, in a way, establish strong links among adults who share the same condition and the same responsibility towards the future generations. This responsibility is something that pertains to the adults, because it is the adults who have to play an educational role. Hence, the problem is to look back at the future, and that at the same time implies also looking ahead, looking to the future. This is a fundamental task, and together with other aspects, this can help us witness the miracle of fertility in young couples. And in this perspective, the role of grandparents is fundamental. Thanks to their physical presence, grandparents are the living testimony of the fact that we belong to a history, and this history comes from past generations. And so that we belong to a people, and we have the responsibility of having these people continue through history. The constant teaching of Pope Francis reassures us in this. He has often stated that it is very important, that the educational role of the grandparents is very important from a number of perspectives. In recent days, in Portugal, the Pope has often talked about the need to establish an intergenerational alliance. And I think that we should all get involved in this. Each and any one of us, both the cultural world and the political world. Grandparents bring with themselves a loving vision of life, and this can give hope to their children, so that their children have are not afraid of giving birth to other human beings. Therefore, the presence of the grandparents helps the children so that they do not live their role as if it were an enemy world, and so that they, in a way, abandon the brave courage of not having child, as Chesterton said. So one can say that grandparents are the friends of their family life and of society as a whole. And therefore, it is important and irrenounceable to make reference to grandparents. And then there's a second practical role for which grandparents have to give their contribution to this topic. And it is something that is visible to everybody. Without any legal requirements and without any requests on the part of the state, grandparents help their children to give birth to their children, and this thanks to the countless services that they implement to help the families of their children. A recent study of the American Census Bureau showed that in the USA, more than 6 million minors live with their grandparents. And this confirms that grandparents are fundamental to reinforce their family ties. Okay, I'm going to speak just once. It's just 9 seconds. No problem. Go on. Actually, what you're reading out is wonderful. No problem. So how many children have been born knowing that the grandparents would support the young couples? This is a outstanding figures. 70% of the grandparents are self-sufficient, and therefore they help. And this is something that is not said. It is not outspoken. And culture and politics have to take this into account. We need to acknowledge the fact that grandparents represent a fundamental component in any family in this society. And this component has to be better promoted and enhanced. So why shouldn't we detax the economic aid that grandparents give to the families of their children and grandchildren? Why don't we allow grandparents, on behalf of their parents, to the school committees? Because sometimes parents cannot attend them. Why don't we involve grandparents more in the painful conditions that actually sometimes concern families in crisis? And why don't we support self-sufficient grandparents who can support non-self-sufficient parents based on the principle of subsidiarity? And this is something that is ignored. Why don't we consider the social security measure in favor of women going in pension earlier so that grandmothers can provide more support in this respect? And this is something that I've already stated in the meeting that in a meeting that was organized by the network called Ditelo sui tetti. And on that occasion, what was asked was that the whole fiscal reform currently undergoing should take the family as its central element. So to conclude, we are sure that grandparents can play a fundamental role in giving their children that hope, supporting them their decision to give birth to their own children, because grandparents know that life is sometimes very hard, but they also know that it is essentially positive and that any difficulty can be overcome, especially within in a context of solidarity between solidarities. Grandparents give hope to their children and grandchildren, and hope is fundamental if you are to decide in giving birth to another human being. So politics and culture should take this into account. Thank you.
Grazie infinite a Peppino Zola, il suo impegno politico
Thanks to Mr. Zola, your political commitment is increasingly vital and challenging for us.
Seguiamo le orme di questi giganti. Ancora un paio di interventi.
Just a couple of contributions, and then we will conclude with the contribution by Minister Roccella.
Ancora da Giancarlo.
So for the second run, Giancarlo, I leave the floor. Well, the second point, apart from telling what is happening and the consequences of that, the second question was, what can we do? So very shortly, first of all, we need to consider that it's not going to be easy at all, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because those that will have to give birth to children are only that had a different kind of education and training from past generations. So they can find it maybe more challenging to accept sacrifices and to make choices before actually having some guarantees that they will actually achieve the expected goals. And the second issue is a political and structural issue concerning mothers. Today we have 12 million women that may have children, and in a few years we will have 9 million women in age of having a child. So for sure, the less girls are born today and the less women that may have children we will have in the future. So what can we do in order to try to achieve those goals and desires that we have been mentioning so far? Well, we need to help our young people being more responsible in making choices for their life as a couple or having a family. So we may think about some kind of supports in terms of housing or in terms of labor and employment. We know what are the most critical points and elements. We need to intervene with some kind of supports based on the resources that we have available, for sure, in order to try to help these challenging situations. Well, of course, children are a cost, not only in terms of money, but in terms of time as well. So, for sure, all kind of economic supports from the state can be useful. And if we consider that, we have been considering that over the last few years, and the situation is different from 20 or 30 years ago, and we have been improving from this point of view. We're going towards the right direction, but it's not easy to go on through this path because of lack of resources, for sure. Then we need to consider the aspect of the costs of children, also in terms of a more positive cultural approach. We need to stop saying that this is a problem of those that have to face it, because this is not the case, because it's an issue involving all of us, because your children will have to pay our pensions in the future. So for sure this is a situation and an issue involving each one of us. So we have a goal to achieve 500,000 newborn babies, and we are now starting from 393,000 newborn babies this year. But we need to try, and we need to involve every one of us. It's not just a matter of the state. The state will have to play a role, the government will have to play a role, local administration will have to play a role, but also the private and social state should do that, should play its own role. But the companies and enterprises as well have a role there. We need to think and implement local initiatives that can bring to achieve results which play a role and have effects on local communities. And I think that also businessmen that achieved his own role, his own goal, may get some kind of satisfactions in seeing his own role played at the local community level. And we need to involve all the stakeholders there that can play a role. It's clear what we should do. It's not a matter of repeating figures and data that each one of us perfectly know. But we know what the trend is. We need now to move from information to action. We are aware that there is an issue, and if this issue requires sacrifices, there may be someone having to pay some further taxes more, maybe, but we need to do that. And I'm sure Italians, in the moment of the need, will meet the need, will give an answer. We need to raise the awareness at the basis of the actions that need to be put forward. And I think that's the path we should go through in the future. Now some further words in terms of economics then. So leave the floor to the economist again. So I think that what Adriano said is the background and what he will tell us concerns the reduction of the costs linked to giving birth to new babies. Let me say that for sure we need to take for granted that this should be done, and we should do it better than we did so far. I would like to make a step forward and add something more, because despite being a necessary condition, the fact of providing economic support to families, this is not enough. In 1986, an economist wrote an article, so I'm talking about 1986, And this economist was Hungarian, and Hungary was, like all Eastern countries, Eastern European countries, was dealing with this declining birth rate. So he was asking himself what to do, starting from the concept, the idea that money are not enough in order to solve the problem. So he put forward 4 possible solutions, and I'd like to mention a couple and share a couple of these solutions that he put forward. These are radical changes that he proposes. These are kind of revolutionary maybe, and maybe someone can even laugh about that, but I kindly invite you to take it seriously, because maybe this is the actual radical approach, the revolutionary approach that we may need today. So the first one is to extend the vote, the right to vote, to minors. So far, all democracies are ignoring the fact that in Italy, 16% of the population are minors. In India, we're talking about 40% of the population. So this has consequences concerning the way public finances are actually spent and considered. So in Italy, all the €7 spent for policies concerning all the population, for public health and pensions, for example, we spend all the €7 for that. We spend €1 for younger people, so education, school. So the ratio is 1 to 7. And this is due to the fact that it's not profitable to promote family policies, because minors are not voting while retired people are voting. So in terms of votes and political approach, it's more profitable to make proposals for pensions and for retired people. So how can we do that? How can we have minors voting? Well, the idea is to involve their parents, and the idea is to make sure and parents will take care of the political interests of their minors. And then the second idea, which has already been mentioned actually, is the so-called opzione donna, which is basically the idea to link future pension services to the fertility rate nowadays, because giving birth to a child today means giving birth to a person that will pay future pensions. And so linking these pension performances to fertility choices is a way to bring back fertility choices at the core of our policies. But let me say that with respect to opzione donna, how is it made? Well, opzione donna is based on the past, so the choices that we made 40 years ago that we can no longer change. So people that 40 years ago decided not to have any child, of course, today cannot go back in the past and change their decision. So opzione donna considers that from a past point of view, so we need to move on to a new approach where present generation may renounce to some of the rights they may have, and they provide these rights to their future generation, to their children. So this may change the birth rate in a positive way. And the second aspect that I'd like to raise and share with you during this debate is the question, why opzione donna? Because the choices in terms of birth rate are made by two people, because there are always two people making a child, giving birth to a child, and this advantage, this benefit should be then recognized both to women and men, not only to women. These are the two key aspects, in my opinion. So thank you for these very interesting remarks. Of course, this is not going to be easy, but we can work on that for sure. And again, the Article 31 of the Italian Constitution states that the Italian Republic shall promote and support families with lots of children. And now the last speech before leaving the floor to the minister. Well, I'm coming from an agricultural family, and let me say that here we are farming a field which deserves to have very proactive and immediate answers, because we have an urgent need, but we need to look forward to the future perspectives. So we need to make investments in order to grow our crops, which is investing on the long term. And that's the need and the demand that we have today and nowadays to the people that are governing our country. And I'm not talking only about people at the government or on the parliament, but I'm talking about the responsibility of all the world of the labor market, the academic world, the third sector, and this is something involving each one of us. So as a forum, we believe there are some needs which need to be addressed immediately, for sure. We need to do that very short, in a very proactive way. And a child is not an individual cost for a family. A child is an asset for which the entire community should invest. And this is a choice we need to make already nowadays, and there are a lot of perspectives to be considered. Of course, the economic support is something which is very important. The so-called assegno unico is already a step forward, but it should be more universal. It should be more able to address to the actual needs of the families. And we are now dealing with fiscal reform, and it's good to hear our ministers and our secretaries that are talking about these reforms and these solutions which are put forward in order to address this, to tackle this issue. It's very important to guarantee an equal fiscal approach which supports families in terms of investments as well. So the forum has always been playing an important role with respect to this context, and today it's important to be aware of what we need to do and have a clear goal. Today in our country, being a parent is very complicated. So young people shall become protagonists of their life, and this is one of the pillars on which we shall invest in the future. So we should consider the possibility of young people to study, to find a job, to buy a home, to create a family. We need to make sure that our children are attracted by this country, by our country, and to desire to go ahead with their life and have a family. Furthermore, there is the situation of women, because for too long our women have not been recognized in their educational, social, economic, and cohesive condition, and too often they've been taken for granted. So this is something we need to invest on with laws that will involve also cultural point of view, of cultural approach. And on the background, we need to make sure that Italy is always considered as an ecosystem where families are well appreciated, they are welcomed, they are recognized as a real asset, a real important element, and the challenge is very important there. So we need to make sure that after having been the worst of Europe over the last decade, we need to become a point of reference as being the best one. So I'd like to say and to suggest to the Minister Roccella, but also to the Prime Minister Meloni, to organize an intergovernmental conference on the birth rate over the next few months, in order to make sure that Italy will lead the way for a real change at the European level, in order to make sure that the birth rate will become a topic debated and discussed with all countries, and understanding that all the money spent for families are not just a cost, but they are an investment. So we need to change the point of view we have for families and not longer considering them as a problem, but as the real resource for our country. And as Pope Francis is saying, family is the place where you grow, you become young, you become an adult then, protagonist of the choices that you make for your own country, for your own community, and then to make sure that there is a future in front of us, because birth rate is first of all a matter of hope.
La parola adesso alla Ministra.
Now the floor to the Minister for Family and Equal Opportunities, Eugenia Roccella. First of all, thank you very much for this meeting, but actually you've already said it all. So I really have little to add. I think we can start from the fact that in Italy, we are at the very beginning when it comes to families for the birth rate, the family, and equal opportunities. The three things are very much connected. I mean, issues related to birth rate are very much related to issues of equal opportunities. The three things, the family is also included in this set of factors closely related. First of all, we need to place the Italian situation in the international context. Professor Blangiardo has already done it. We know that the declining birth rate does not concern Europe or the Western world at all, but it concerns the whole world. I've recently happened to read a very interesting article on Korea. Korea, up to 25 years ago, was one of the poorest countries in the world, but then it has very rapidly developed. Up to 25 years ago, there were 6 children per mother, per woman. After 25 years, I think the average birth rate is 0.8. So they're, doing worse than Italy. The whole of Europe, that same Europe, which invested a lot in family policies. For example, France is probably the country that identified the problem of the declining birth rate very early as in the mid-1980s. And in France as well, figures say that they have gone down they've gone below the, so to say, substitution rate, which used to be 2.1 and now is 2. So France is recording a substitution rate which is below the 2%. And this in spite of the fact that France has invested a lot in this. At the same time, this percentage is going down. This year in France as well, the birth rate is declining. So this is a problem that does not affect Italy alone. And that is due to the fact that for too long, a cultural climate against an increase in the birth rate has been present. In the 1980s, France was more far-sighted and started with policies supporting the birth rate. And at that time, the Perez de Cuéllar, the then UN General Secretary, basically awarded China for its single-child policies, which were very authoritarian and violent policies which caused a lot of pain to people. In the 1960s, and this is also something that Mr. Rizzolli mentioned, in Italy we had the Club of Rome. That was a very important high-level think tank, including scientists and high-level intellectuals, who said that there was an imbalance between resources and the number of inhabitants, and therefore, in order to make up for that imbalance, one had to act on the only lever that could be played upon, because resources could not be multiplied. And therefore, it was necessary to, in a way, kind of break, to stop the birth rate. And this was done in a very pressing and heavy and widespread way. And the results are before our eyes. We are now living in a situation in which being parents, being open to the future, to solidarity between generations, continuity between grandparents and grandchildren, and accepting the fact that life is not only actually in the here and now, and that life does not end in the fact that we live only for the current moment, but that life is something that looks ahead of us, and that there is continuity, and that this continuity is fundamental for the social hold, for the social cohesion, for capacity and solidarity, because solidarity is a fundamental aspect of our coexistence. All of this has been dismantled. And as Bordignon rightly says, Italy should be in the front line of this inversion of the trend. In my view, I think we can do it. Even if Italy is one of the countries that thought about policy, families, to a very limited extent, we can make it. Probably this, we had a climate impoverishing in the 1970s and 80s. There was the idea that Italy was too much focused on the family. I mean, this was probably taken too much for granted. And then at the same time, there were also ideological issues vis-a-vis the policies in favor of the birth rate. And therefore, it was the idea that birth rate policies were something that could not be implemented. So we had to, in a way, we suffered. We were affected by this situation, probably more than other countries. At the end of the last legislature, we had a social security measure called Assegno Unico, this kind of single indemnity for families, which is now being investigated from Brussels. But actually, we've done very little for the families and for increasing the birth rate. So can we become leaders of an inversion of the trend in Europe? I think we can. First of all, I think that it is important that the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, is a woman. She's a woman, she's a mother. And that's important because she perfectly and fully understands the difficulties that women have in actually being free to have children. There is a big problem. Many people would like to have children. They continue saying that they want to have 2 children, and then they don't have 2 children because there is a problem of freedom. It's difficult to combine professional needs, their professional life with their family life. And it's not only that. Actually, for example, there was something that I said that was misunderstood. I talked about the spritz, so an aperitif. What I said was completely misunderstood. Actually, I talked about the fact that there is an alternative between having an aperitif and children. And what I intended was there is an alternative between a specific way of living, a specific lifestyle, and the fact that contemporary times give us a chance to have fun on the one hand, and on the other hand, investing in having children. And I said, well, this alternative should not be there. We would like women to have children and have an aperitif and have a spritz at the same time. We don't want that women find it difficult and challenging to have children, that they consider it to be a sacrifice. We would like them to perceive this decision as an additional joy, as an additional element for happiness. Plus, a recent study coming from the Anglo-Saxon world has shown that having children makes us happy. And So all parents know that having children implies actually adopting a different lifestyle compared to the lifestyle of those who do not have children. But it also implies becoming richer from an interior point of view. But it also means that we can do something else for other people. So I think we can reverse the trend. And we've started doing that. Especially at my ministry. For the first time, we've added the term birth rate, natalità, to the word family and equal opportunities. And bringing the three themes together is new, has been new. We kind of adopted a cross-cutting approach. Bordignon actually suggested that we organize a conference, but actually we do this at every Council of Ministers. There is this criterion, cross-cutting criterion that we've always adopted, meaning the idea is that we do not give the responsibility only to my ministry and the responsibility and the task of reversing the trend and kind of stopping the declining birth rate so that we give back to a situation in which people can become free again to give birth to other human beings. But rather we work in a with a cross-cutting approach, meaning that all acts, all decisions have to take into considerations the family and children. And we did that, for example, with the tax power, with the new tax measures, and then we will do that also with the implementing decisions. We've done that in the decision that kind of replaced the state subsidy, because the new measure is targeted to families with children, because it needed to act to reduce child poverty. So we did that in a number of minor and major legislative decisions. We increased the amount of the assegno unico indemnity, and this is especially for large families. There's few large families, but the children who live inside large families are in a much larger percentage. So in percentage terms, they account for a higher number compared to the other families. We did that, and I have here the whole list of the measures that we've taken. I can read them all. So reducing the VAT on products for children, increasing the amount of parental leaves from 30 to 80%, then diminishing taxes for the hiring of women, subsidized mortgages for the purchase of property. We will do that in the next budget law. Experts are telling us that if we want to increase the birth rate, we need to make sure that those women wishing, those couples wishing to have a second child can have it, so that we have to kind of leverage on the decision to have a second child. So on the occasion of the next budget law, I will put forward a set of measures facilitating decisions for couples to have the second child. But I think we need to move beyond this. There is also sometimes a problem of mothers feeling lonely. Sometimes mothers live in a city other than the one where their parents, where the family of origin lives, or the family of origin of their partner lives. So at that moment, we're trying to draft a piece of legislation that supports women during their pregnancy. There are many young girls who probably have never held a child in their arms. They have no sisters, they have no aunts. I mean, they don't have that network surrounding them, supporting them in supporting young mothers and giving them their first aid. I mean, we know, I mean, when we had our first child, we didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to do with this child. Maybe when the child was crying and how we would have to bathe him or her. These were things that were in the past communicated by the family, by this exchange of information between women. But today this has become very, very difficult. So our problem lies in supporting women. Our welfare system is very protective for mothers. However, it is in line with lifestyles and ways to organize the times and places of the centers which are outdated. So we need to become updated. We want to look forward. And plus, if you are to increase the birth rate, you hope that there can be some kind of a birth spring. One wants to kind of create legislative acts which are in line with the current times, which are in line with today's lifestyles. So the idea is to focus on supporting maternity, for example, with home services, or someone actually visiting the young mother. So, well, by way of conclusion, I'd just like to say that we can do a lot of things. Some of them we've done, or we've already done. There is a measure in the NRRP, gender certification for companies, or a discipline code in the companies. The idea is also to kind of support and push the involvement of companies so that there is business welfare that pays attention to the needs of mothers. I always speak of maternity and not of paternity, not because I think that fathers are less important. I do believe that in order to have a family, you need a mother and a father, but rather because... Thank you very much, Eugenia. Rather, I think that it is the mothers who actually go through pregnancy and then labor, and this becomes a problem for their career. It is the mothers who actually pay high specific costs for that, and so we have to support them. We have to involve everybody, and actually here you are all experts in subsidiarity, and this is what we need. We need a government action that is cross-cutting, that is compact, and I think that we will work for that. But we also need the involvement of everybody, of the companies, of the local governments, of the municipalities, and of all actors involved, all players involved. Only if we actually make this possible and support subsidiarity, I think we will be able to kind of stop the decline in birth rate and become leaders in this cultural change. Thank you very much, wholeheartedly. We have to close because time is running short. I would like just to remind you that the remaining meeting can exist thanks to the contribution of everybody. So please donate now if you want, and if you can, please contribute to the life of this event. Thank you very much to our guests. Thanks to our minister. And let's hope and work in this direction. Thank you.
Va bene, grazie.
La civiltà civiltà dell'amore. Fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
Dieci racconti di solidarietà e aiuto concreto. Storie ricche d'amore, riscatto, coraggio e cura. Storie di persone che donano e che ispirano a costruire una società inclusiva. Una mano a chi sostiene. Storie.